Where There's Hope by Jerome Bixby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Where There's Hope by Jerome Bixby. If you called me here to tell me to have a child, Mary Pornson said, you can just forget about it. We girls have made up our minds. Hugh Farrell, Chief Medical Officer of the Exodus 7, sighed and leaned back in his chair. He looked at Mary's husband. "And you, Ralph?" he said. "How do you feel?" Ralph Pornson looked at Mary uncomfortably, started to speak, and then hesitated. Hugh Farrell sighed again and closed his eyes. It was that way with all the boys. The wives had the whip hand. If the husbands put up an argument, they'd simply get turned down flat. No sex at all, children or otherwise. The threat, Farrell thought wryly, made the boys softer than watered putty. His own wife, Alice, was one of the ringleaders of the No Babies movement, and since he had openly declared warfare on the idea, she wouldn't even let him kiss her good night. For fear of losing her determination, Farrell liked to think. He opened his eyes again to look past the Pornsons, out of the curving port of his office lab in the Exodus 7's flank, at the scene outside the ship. At the edge of the clearing he could see Danny Stern and his crew, tiny beneath the cavernous sunbeam-shot overhang of giant leaves. Danny was standing up at the controls of the dozer, waving his arms. His crew was struggling to get a log set, so he could shove it into place with the dozer. They were repairing a break in the barricade, the place where one of New Earth's giant saurians had come stamping and whistling through last night to kill 3 colonists before it could be blasted out of existence. It was difficult, damned difficult. A brand new world here, all ready to receive the refugees from dying Earth, or rather all ready to be made ready, which was the task ahead of the Exodus 7's personnel. An Earth-like world, green, warm, fertile, and crawling, leaping, hooting, and snarling with ferocious beasts of every variety. Farrell could certainly see the women's point in banding together and refusing to produce children. Something inside a woman keeps her from wanting to bring life into peril, at least when the peril seems temporary and security is both remembered and anticipated. Pornson said, "I guess I feel just about like Mary does. I don't see any reason for having a kid until we get this place ironed out and safe to live in." "That's going to take time, Ralph." Farrell clasped his hands in front of him and delivered the speech he had delivered so often in the past few weeks. 10 or 12 years before we really get set up here. We've got to build from the ground up, you know. We'll have to find and mine our metals, build our machines, to build shops, to build more machines. There'll be resources that we won't find, and we'll have to learn what this planet has to offer in their stead. Colonizing New Earth isn't simply a matter of landing and throwing together a shining city. I only wish it were. 6 weeks ago we landed. We haven't yet dared to venture more than a mile from this spot. We've cut down trees and built the barricade and our houses. After protecting ourselves, we have to eat. We've planted gardens. We've produced test tube calves and piglets. The calves are doing fine, but the piglets are dying one by one. We've got to find out why. It's going to be a long, long time before we have even a minimum of security, much less luxury. Longer than you think. So much longer that waiting until the security arrives before having children is out of the question. There are critters out there, he nodded toward the port and the busy clearing beyond, that we haven't been able to kill. We've thrown everything we have at them and they come back for more. We'll have to find out what will kill them, how they differ from those we are able to kill. We are 600 people and a spaceship, Ralph. We have techniques, that's all. Everything else we've got to dig up out of this planet. We'll need people, Mary. We'll need the children. We're counting on them. They're vital to the plans we've made." Mary Pornson said, "Damn the plans. I won't have one. Not now. You've just done a nice job of describing all my reasons, and all the other girls feel the same way." She looked out the window at the dozer and crew. Danny Stern was still waving his arms. The log was almost in place. "George and May Wright were killed last night. So was Forelli. If George and May had had a child, the monster would have trampled it too. It went right through their cabin like cardboard. It isn't fair to bring a baby into—" Farrell said, "Fair, Mary? Maybe it isn't fair not to have one, not to bring it into being and give it a chance. Life's always a gamble." "It doesn't exist," Mary said. She smiled. "Don't try circumlocution on me, Doc. I'm not religious. I don't believe that spermatozoa and an ovum, if not allowed to cuddle up together, add up to murder." "That isn't what I meant." "You were getting around to it, which means you've run out of good arguments." "No, I have a few left." Farrell looked at the two stubborn faces. Mary's, pleasant and pretty but set as steel. Ralph's, uncomfortable, thoughtful, but mirroring his definite willingness to follow his wife's lead. Farrell cleared his throat. "You know how important it is that this colony be established. You know that, don't you? In 20 years or so the ships will start arriving, hundreds of them. Because we sent a message back to Earth saying we'd found a habitable planet. Thousands of people from Earth coming here to the new world we're supposed to get busy and carve out for them. We were selected for that task. First of judging the right planet, then of working it over. Engineers, chemists, agronomists, all of us. We're the task force. We've got to do the job. We've got to test, plant, breed, rebalance, create. There'll be a lot of trial and error. We've got to work out a way of life so the thousands who will follow can be introduced safely and painlessly into the organism. And we'll need new blood for the jobs ahead. We'll need young people." Mary said, "A few years one way or the other won't matter much, Doc. 5 or 6 years from now this place will be a lot safer. Then we women will start producing, but not now." "It won't work that way," Farrell said. "We're none of us kids any longer. I'm 55. Ralph, you're 43. I realize that I must be getting old to think of you as young. Mary, you're 37. We took a long time getting here, 14 years. We left an Earth that's dying of radioactive poisoning, and we all got a mild dose of that. The radiation we absorbed in space, little as it was, didn't help any. And that sun up there," again he nodded at the port, "isn't any help either. Periodically it throws off some pretty damned funny stuff. Frankly, we're worried. We don't know whether or not we can have children, or normal children. We've got to find out. If our genes have been bollocksed up, we've got to find out why and how and get to work on it immediately. It may be unpleasant, it may be heartbreaking, but those who will come here in 20 years will have absorbed much more of Earth's radioactivity than we did, and an equal amount of the space stuff, and this sun will be waiting for them. We'll have to know what we can do for them." "I'm not a walking laboratory, Doc," Mary said. "I'm afraid you are, Mary. All of you are." Mary set her lips and stared out the port. "It's got to be done, Mary." She didn't answer. "It's going to be done." "Choose someone else," she said. "That's what they all say." She said, "I guess this is one thing you doctors and psychologists didn't figure on, Doc." "Not at first," Farrell said, "but we've given it some thought." McGuire had installed the button convenient to Farrell's right hand just below the level of the desktop. Farrell pressed it. Ralph and Mary Pornsen slumped in their chairs. The door opened, and Dr. John J. McGuire and Ted Harris, the Exodus 7's chief psychologist, came in. When it was over, and the afterplay had been allowed to run its course, Farrell told the Pornsens to go into the next room and shower. They came back soon, looking refreshed. Farrell ordered them to get back into their clothes. Under the power of the hypnotic drug which their chairs had injected into them at the touch of the button, they did so. Then he told them to sit down in the chairs again. McGuire and Harris had gathered up their equipment, piling it on top of the operating table. McGuire smiled. "I'll bet that's the best monitored, most hygienic sex act they ever committed. I think I've about got the space radiation's effect licked." Farrell nodded. "If anything goes wrong, it certainly won't be our fault. But let's face it, the chances are 1,000 to 1 that something will go wrong. We'll just have to wait and work." He looked at the Pornsens. "They're very much in love, aren't they?" And she was receptive to the suggestion. Beneath it all, she was burning to have a child, just like the others. McGuire wheeled out the operating table with its load of serums, pressure hypos, and jury-rigged thingamabobs, which he was testing on alternate couples. Ted Harris stopped at the door a moment. He said, "I think the suggestions I planted will turn the trick when they find out she's pregnant. They'll come through okay. Won't even be too angry." Farrell sighed. They'd been over it in detail several times, of course, but apparently Harris needed the reassurance as much as he did. He said, "Sure. Now scram so I can go back into my act." Harris closed the door. Farrell sat down at his desk and studied the pair before him. They looked back contentedly, holding hands, their eyes dull. Farrell said, "How do you feel?" Ralph Pornsen said, "I feel fine." Mary Pornsen said, "Oh, I feel wonderful." Deliberately, Farrell pressed another button below his desktop. The dull eyes cleared instantly. "Oh, you've given it some thought, Doc," Mary said sweetly. "And what have you decided?" "You'll see," Farrell said, eventually. He rose. "That's all for now, kids. I'd like to see you again in 1 month for a routine checkup." Mary nodded and got up. "You'll still have to wait, Doc. Why not admit you're licked?" Ralph got up too and looked puzzled. "Wow," he said, "I'm tired." "Perhaps just coming here," Farrell said, "discharged some of the tension you've been carrying around." The Pornsens left. Farrell brought out some papers from his desk and studied them. Then, from the file drawer, he selected the record of Hugh and Alice Farrell. Alice would be at the perfect time of her menstrual cycle tomorrow. Farrell flipped his communicator. "McGuire," he said, "tomorrow it's me." McGuire chuckled. Farrell could have kicked him. He put his chin in his hands and stared out the port. Danny Stern had the log in place in the barricade. The bulldozer was moving on to a new task. His momentary doubt stilled, Farrell went back to work. 21 years later, when the ships from Earth began arriving, the log had been replaced by a stone monument erected to the memory of the Exodus 7, which had been cut apart for its valuable steel. Around the monument was a park, and on 3 sides of the park was a shining town, not really large enough to be called a city, of plastic and stone, for New Earth had no iron ore, only zinc and a little copper. This was often cause for regret. Still, it was a pretty good world. The monster problem had been licked by high-voltage cannon. Now, in their 3rd generation since the landing, the monsters kept their distance, and things grew, things good to eat. And even without steel, the graceful, smoothly functioning town looked impressive. Quite a thing to have been built by a handful of beings with 2 arms and 2 legs each. It hadn't been entirely, but nobody thought much about that anymore. Even the newcomers got used to it. Things change. End of Where There's Hope by Jerome Bixby.
Wizard by Larry M. Harris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Green, Lancashire, UK. Wizard by Larry M. Harris. Although the masquerade itself, as a necessary protection against non-telepaths, was not fully formulated until the late years of the 17th century, groups of telepaths in hiding existed long before that date. Whether such groups were the results of natural mutations, or whether they came into being due to some other cause, has not yet been fully determined, but that a group did exist in the district of Offenburg, in what is now Prussia, we are quite sure. The activities of the group appear to have begun, approximately, in the year 1594, but it was not until 11 years after that date that they achieved a signal triumph, the first and perhaps the last of its kind, until the dissolution of the masquerade in 2103. Excerpt from a short story of the masquerade by A. Milge, Crystal 704-54-368, produced 2440. Jonas came over the hill, whistling as if he had not a care in the world, which was not even approximately true, he reflected happily. The state of complete and utter quiet was both foreign and slightly repugnant to him. He was never more pleased than when he had a job in hand, a job that involved a slight and unavoidable risk. This time, of course, the risk was more than slight. Why, he thought happily, it was even possible for him to get killed, and most painfully too. With a great deal of pleasure he stood for a second at the crest of the hill, his hands on his hips, looking down at the town of Speyer as it baked in the May afternoon sunlight. Jonas did not, in spite of his pose, look like the typical hero of folk-tale or scribe's tome. He was not 7 feet tall, for instance, nor did he have a handsome, lovesome face with flashing blue eyes, or a broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted marvel of a figure. He was, instead, somewhat shorter than the average of men in Europe in 1605, and for some time thereafter. He had small, almost hidden eyes that seemed to see a great deal, but failed completely to make a fuss about the fact. And while his figure was just a trifle dumpy, his face completed the rhyme by being extraordinarily lumpy. The nose, as a matter of strict truth, was hard to distinguish from the other contusions, swellings, and marks that covered the head. Nor, of course, did he carry the sword of a great hero or a noble. Jonas had no Van to stick to his name, and he had never thought it worth his while to claim one and accept the tiny risk of disclosure. After all, a noble was only a man like other men, and besides, Jonas knew perfectly well that he had no need of a sword. His adventures, too, were a little out of the common run of tales. Jonas had, he thought regretfully, few duels to look forward to, and he had even fewer to look back on. And as a maid is won by face, figure, and daring, and a wife by riches, position, or prospects, there was a notable paucity of lissom ladies in Jonas's career. All in all, he thought sadly, he was not a usual hero. But he refused to let the thought spoil his enjoyment. After all, he was a hero, though of his own unique kind, there was no denying that. And in his own way he had his reward. He took one hand off his hip to scratch the top of his head, wondering briefly if he had managed to pick up lice in the last town he had visited, and he took another look at the city. Speyer seemed a lot better at first glance than some of the other places Jonas had visited. For one thing, it had a full town hall, built no less of honest stone, and probably a relict of the Roman times. There was the parish church, of course, a good solid wooden structure, and a collection of houses strung along the dirt paths of the town. The houses of the rich were naturally wooden, the poor built of baked mud. There were a great many baked mud structures, and only one wooden one, besides the church, that Jonas could see. The paths were winding, but comparatively free from slop. That was pleasing, he told himself. And the buildings themselves, wood, mud, and stone, clustered in the valley below him, as if they were afraid and needed each other's protection. Which, in a way, they did. Jonas reflected on that a trifle grimly, thinking of the Holy Inquisition, with its hierarchy of priests and lay folk, busily working in Speyer just as it worked in every other town throughout Offenburg and throughout the civilized world. Ordinarily, he would not have given it a thought, beyond a passing sigh for the ways of the world. He had other business. But now... He grinned to himself, and the grin turned to a laugh as he started down the hill. The grislier methods of the inquisitorial process were well known to him by reputation, and soon he might be testing them out for himself. There was absolutely no way to be sure. That thought pleased him greatly. After all, he told himself, there was nothing like a little danger to spice the boring business of living. By the time he reached the bottom of the hill, he was whistling loudly. He stopped at the first house, a mud construction, with a badly carpentered wooden door and a single bare window that looked out on the street. It smelled, but Jonas went up to the door bravely and knocked. There was no answer. He went on whistling Fortuna Plango Vulnera under his breath, and after a time he knocked again. This time he heard movement inside the house and nodded to himself in a satisfied fashion. But almost a minute passed before the head of an old woman showed itself at the window. She was really extraordinarily ugly, he thought. She wore a bonnet that did nothing whatever to enhance her doubtful, wrinkled charms, or to conceal them, and besides it was dirty.
"Nobody's here,"
she said in the voice of a very venomous toad.
"Go away."
Jonas smiled at her. It was an effort. "Madam," he began politely.
"Nobody's home,"
she repeated, drawing slightly back from the window.
"You go away, now."
"Ah," said Jonas pleasantly. "But you're home, aren't you?" The old woman frowned at him suspiciously.
"Now,"
she said vaguely.
"Well?"
"This is your house," he said. "The house where you live?"
"Never saw you before,"
the old woman said. "That's right," Jonas said equably.
"You come to turn me out?"
she demanded. Her eyebrows, which were almost as big and black as her ancient moustache, came down over glittering little eyes.
"I hold this house free and proper,"
she said in a determined roar,
"and nobody can take it from me. It belongs to me, and to my children, and to their children, and to the children of those children."
The catalogue seemed likely to go on forever. "Exactly," Jonas said hastily.
"Well then,"
the old woman said, and started to draw back. Jonas gestured lazily with one hand. "Wait," he said. "I am not going to take your house away from you, madam. I am only here to ask you a question."
"Question?"
she said.
"You come from Herr Knupf. I'm an old woman, but I do no wrong, and there is no one can accuse me of heresy. I'm in church every week, and more than once. I keep peace with my neighbours, and there's none can say a mystery about me." The woman, Jonas thought, was full to the eyebrows with words. Probably, he told himself, trying to be fair, she didn't have anyone to talk to until a stranger came along. He sighed briefly. "I do not come from the Inquisitor," he said truthfully, "nor is my question one that should cause you alarm." The old woman pondered for a minute. She leaned her elbows on the window sill, getting them muddy. But that, Jonas thought, didn't seem to matter to this creature, apparently. "Ask,"
she said at last. Jonas put on his most pleasant expression. "Madam," he said, "I wish to know if there be any family in this town to give room to a wayfarer, understanding, of course, that the wayfarer would insist on paying well," he added. The old woman blinked.
"You looking for an inn?"
she said.
"An inn in this town?"
The idea appeared to strike her as the very height of idiocy. She covered her face with her hands and shook. After a second, Jonas discovered that she was laughing. He waited patiently until the fit had left her. "Not an inn," he said. "There is no inn here, I know. But a family willing to take in a stranger—"
"Strangers are seldom here," she said. "Herr Knupf watches his flock with zeal."
Which meant, Jonas reflected, that he was in a fair way to get himself burned as a heretic, unless he watched his step carefully. "Herr Knupf's fame has reached my own country far away," he said with some truth. "Nevertheless, a family which—"
"Wait," she said. "You have said that you will pay well, yet you do not appear rich."
Jonas understood. Fishing in his sewn pocket, he withdrew a single shiny coin. "I also wish," he said smoothly, "to pay for any help I may receive, such as the answering of an innocent question, a question in which the respected Inquisitor Knopf can have no interest whatever." The old woman's eyes went to the coin and stayed there.
"Well," she said, "it is said that the family called Sharp has a house too large for them, now that the elder son's gone. There is only the man, the wife, and a daughter. It is said that the man is in need of money. He would accept payment, were it generous, in return for sharing room with his house."
"I would be most grateful," Jonas murmured. He passed the coin over. The old woman's hand snatched it and closed on it. "Where might I find this family?" he said.
"It is now late in the afternoon," the old woman said. "Perhaps they are at home. You will see a path which takes you to the left. Follow it until you reach the last house. Knock at the door."
"I shall," Jonas said, "and many thanks." The old woman, still clutching her coin, disappeared from the window as if someone had yanked her back. Jonas turned with relief and got back on the path, but it stank quite as badly as the house had. He endured the stench heroically. Sharp proved to be a barrel-shaped man who was unaccountably cheerless, as if the inside structure had been carefully removed and then replaced by sawdust, Jonas thought. Even the offer of 7 kroner for a single week's stay failed to produce the delirious joy Jonas had expected. "The money is needed," Sharp said, in a dour, bass voice, staring off past Jonas's left ear at the darkening sky. "And for the money, you will be welcome. I must take your word that you're not dangerous. I can only pray that you do not betray that trust." It was far from a warm welcome, but Jonas was satisfied with it. "I shall work to do you good," he said, "and not evil." "Stranger," Sharp said, "work for your own good. Do nothing for me. This is an accursed family. There is no good to be done to me or to my wife or child." Jonas tried to look reassuring. He thought of several things to say about the sunny side of life and decided on none of them. "My sympathy," he began. "Your sympathy may endanger you," Sharp said. "My son is gone. I pray that there is an end to it." Jonas peered once into the mind of the man and recoiled violently. But he had enough in that one glimpse to tell him the reason for Sharp's misery, and it was quite reason enough, he thought. "Herr Knopf." "We do not mention that name," Sharp said. "My wife has resigned herself to what has happened. I am not so wise." "I promise you," Jonas said earnestly, "that you will be in no danger from me. No, more, that I will help you out of your difficulties and ensure your peace." "Then you are an angel from heaven," Sharp said bitterly. "There is no other help, while the Inquisitor remains and our sons become suspect to his rages." Jonas shook his head. "There is help," he said, "and you will find it. Your son is gone, accused, questioned, confessed, and burnt. But there will be no more." Sharp looked at him for a long time. "Come with me," he said at last, and led the way into his mud house. Inside there was only one large room, but it seemed spacious enough for 4. 3 pallets lay against the far right wall, a single one against the left. Sharp went to the back of the house, near the single bed. "This will be yours," he said, "while you are with us. It is poor, but it is all we can offer." "I'm honoured," Jonas said. "Here we are alone," Sharp went on, his voice lowering. "My wife and daughter have gone to visit a neighbour, for they have not yet closed us off entirely from all human contact." He grimaced. Jonas peered into the mind again, very gently, but the mad roiling of pain and memory there were too strong for him, and he returned. "If you have anything to say to me," Sharp said, "tell me now. No one can hear us, not Herr Knopf himself." "To say to you?" "Regarding your plan," Sharp said. "Surely you have a plan, and if I may play any part in it." Jonas blinked. "Plan?" he said. "Of course," Sharp said. "You speak of an end to troubles, an end to the Inquisition and the burnings, an end to the Question. And so you must have a plan for ridding us of Herr Knopf, one which you will tell me." Jonas shook his head. "I have no plan," he said. "It means danger," Sharp pressed him. "But I do not mind danger, in such a cause. I am not vengeful, but my son was no wizard. Yet the Inquisitor took him and had a confession from him. You know well the worth of such confessions. And soon there will be others, for when the curse strikes a family it does not stop with one member. He tightened his lips. "It is not for myself, I am afraid," he said. Jonas nodded. "Were there such a plan," he said, "be assured I would tell you." "But there is none," Jonas said. "Herr Knupf shall remain, for all that I can do, while the earth remains." Sharp opened his mouth, shut it again, and then shrugged. "I see," he said at last. "You do not trust me. Perhaps you're wise. I might talk foolishly. I'm an old man. Older in this last month than in all my other years." "Believe me," Jonas began, "I—" "Let it be," Sharp said quietly. "I believe you. If that is what you want, I believe you." He shrugged again, moving out towards the door of the hut. "And in any case," he said, "the money is needed. For there are fines to pay, and costs of the Inquisition." "I understand," Jonas said helplessly. Sharp turned and looked him full in the face. In the big man's eyes, bitterness and hopelessness glittered. "I'm sure you do," he said, and turned again towards the door. The others he met only briefly. Frau Sharp was a little woman with the face of a walnut, who looked as if she had never really been cheerful. Her son's death, he saw when he looked into her mind, had not come as a surprise to her. It was one more unhappy event in a lifetime in which she had expected nothing else. Unhappiness, she told herself, was her portion in this life. In the life above, things would be different. Jonas had met the type before, and was uninterested in going further. But Ilse Sharp was something else entirely. She did not say a word to him, coming into the house that evening, a pace behind her mother, like an obedient slave. She was about 17, and her mind was as fresh and clean and pretty as her face and figure. Jonas started musing on heroes again, but he never had the chance to make a move toward her. She had a very nice smile, and from memories in the others' minds he could hear her voice, low and quiet, and entirely satisfactory. Jonas sighed. The job, he told himself sternly, came first, and afterward... though come to think of it, there wouldn't be an afterward. The evening meal was simple. There was a single dish of meat and some sort of beans. After it had been eaten, and the darkness outside grew to full night, it was time to retire. Jonas went over to his pallet, moved his jerkin and shoes, and lay down. He heard the others readying themselves for sleep, but he did not look into their minds. Soon they were asleep, and breathing heavily. But Jonas stayed awake for a while.
"It's really too bad we can't work this sort of thing at a distance," Claerten's voice said suddenly. "But then none of us has ever met the man, and you can't read a mind if you haven't had some physical contact with the man who owns it."
"It is too bad," Jonas agreed politely. 500 miles away, Claerten chuckled, and the linkage of minds transmitted the amusement to Jonas.
"You don't think so, at any rate," the director said. "You're having adventures and a fine time. It's the sort of thing you like, after all."
Jonas shrugged mentally. "I suppose so," he said. "I like to work on my own, do my own job."
"And it's got you into trouble before," Claerten said. "But you can't afford any mistakes this time."
"I know the risk perfectly well," Jonas thought back. Claerten's thoughts carried a wry echo.
"You know the risk to yourself," he told Jonas, "and you've accepted that. You rather like it, as a matter of fact, but you haven't thought of the risk to the rest of us, and to the town you're in."
Jonas sent a thought of uncertainty. What? Claerten transmitted the entire picture in one sudden blow. The chance that Jonas would not be killed immediately, but it would be discovered. The chance that the Inquisitor would get from him the secret of the Brotherhood.
"That's impossible,"
Jonas said. Claerten sounded resigned.
"Nothing's impossible," he said. "And if the secret is let out, why, the Brotherhood is finished. Finished before it's barely started. Because you can read a man's mind doesn't mean you can defeat him, Jonas."
"But you know what he's going to do."
"And if he's got you in a wooden house, and he's going to burn it down, what good does your knowledge do you?"
"But you can transmit false thoughts."
"And confuse him," Claerten said. "Fine, fine, if you've ever met the man before, and suppose you haven't. Then you can't transmit a thing to him. You're trapped in the house, remember, and the fire's started. What good's your telepathy?"
"But..."
It's a sense, Claerten said, like any other sense, but it isn't magic any more than your eyes are magic. They're given by God, if you like. They grow, they develop, so the ability to read minds, to transmit thought, is given by God. No one knows why or how. 15 of us have developed it. 15 who are members of the Brotherhood. But there are others. Of course, Jonas thought impatiently. I know all that. You know a great deal, Claerten said, which I sometimes find it necessary to bring to your attention. I've done all right, Jonas thought sullenly. Claerten agreed. Of course you have, he thought, but you're not the most careful of men, and great care is needed. The Brotherhood must grow. This new sense is of great value. Perhaps we can learn to teach it to others in time, though we have had little success with that. But at the least we can maintain our numbers, pass the gift on to our children. If it is possible, Jonas said. We must try, Claerten said, and your job is enormously important. I know that, Jonas thought wearily. You have accomplished the first step, Claerten said. Do nothing rash. Of course not. You will not accept help. I will not, Jonas thought. Very well then, Claerten thought. There was the ghost of another idea. Jonas caught it. I know perfectly well that you wouldn't have sent me if there were any other available member, he thought. There's no need to remind me. I'm sorry, Claerten thought. He radiated caution, worry, patience. Jonas turned the bed and cut off from the director with a grunt. He was tired. Long-distance linkages were a drain on the body's energy, even when the person involved was easy to visualize, but Claerten had insisted on intermittent contact. If there was such a thing as total contact, constant contact over a period of days, Jonas thought, Claerten would use me like a puppet, a veritable Punch among men. He would override me and take me over the way a travelling entertainer rules his jointed dolls. And that would be a fine thing for a hero, wouldn't it? He grimaced in the darkness. Constant contact was simply impossible. Any reaching out used energy, and linking up for a long period simply burned the body up like long starvation. It was as bad as a penance. Jonas was thankful for that. And for the rest, well, he thought resignedly, what was a hero without a quest? And what was a quest without someone to set it? But that someone had to be Claerten, with his caution and his old woman worry. Jonas sighed and set about the business of falling asleep. The days passed slowly with great boredom. Jonas made contact twice with Claerten, who told him over and over to wait, to do nothing. The next move is coming soon. Do nothing to hurry it. You can only upset the natural course of events. Which is unwise, Jonas thought bitterly, and risky, and very probably impious as well. As for the piety, Claerten thought, I leave that to the priests and the women, but wisdom and caution are my task, Jonas, as they must be yours. You are a hero, out on an adventure, Claerten thought witheringly, but set your course with sense, travel it with caution. You will the more certainly arrive. Philosophy for a dull plodder, Jonas thought. Philosophy for one of the Brotherhood, Claerten thought back. We are tiny as yet, we have no force. You can add to that force, add greatly, but you must be wise. I must be slow, you mean? I mean what I have told you, Claerten thought. And one more thing, Jonas. Yes? The daughter, Claerten thought. I have seen her in your mind. Ignore the wench. Is she worth what your task is worth? I never... Then my caution is unnecessary, Claerten thought. But in the unlikely case that she might tempt you to folly, remember it. Jonas, who disliked irony, sighed and cut off. That was the third night. During the days he had done the things he had planned. He did no work with the Sharps, but let them find him, when they returned to the hut in the evening, reciting strange words. Once he built a small outdoor fire and walked around it, widdershins, for several minutes. Then he put out the fire and went inside. He wasn't sure whether or not anyone was watching him that time. But sooner or later it had to happen. And it happened, as Jonas had suspected it would, through the wife. Mrs. Sharp came back to the hut early one day, threw a frightened glance at Jonas sitting in a corner doing nothing at all, and left. He hardly needed to see into her mind to know where she was going, and 20 minutes later 2 men came to the hut.
They stood in the open doorway, Mrs. Sharp behind them twittering like an ancient bird, and Jonas watched them boredly. They were giants for this part of the world, almost 6 feet tall, with great hands and jaws. One had black coarse hair on his head and a stubble about his face, the other was bald as an egg.
"That's him,"
Mrs. Sharp said, just a trifle hesitantly.
"He's the one. He came to stay with us, and we didn't know."
The man with the black hair said, Good. Herr Knopf said take him back, the bald one added. Herr Knopf, Jonas said, entering the conversation with a light, pleasant tone.
"He's the...
Mrs. Sharp tried to get the word out, and then pushed by the two men and came into the hut.
I didn't want to, but there's something strange, and we can't afford any suspicion, and...
Jonas realised slowly that she was crying as she looked at him. It's all right, he said uncomfortably.
I'll be perfectly all right,
Jonas said. He stood up. This Herr Knopf, he said, he wants to see me. He said bring you along, the bald man told him. The black-haired man nodded very slowly. Good, he said. Jonas sighed and went forward to meet the two big men, leaving Mrs. Sharp sobbing in the background. The poor woman felt terrible, he knew, but there was nothing he could do about that. Then let us go, he said, and marched off. Feeling that one more effect wouldn't hurt, he led the way to the town hall. Let them figure out how he had known just where to go, he thought. Their minds were very, very boring, and quite blank. Herr Knopf, Jonas reflected, might be a definite relief. First there was the cell, which was in the basement of the town hall. It was damp, and the air was not too good, but there were compensations. Rats, for instance. Jonas told himself after the first couple of hours that he simply wouldn't have known what to do without the rats. Trying to trap and kill them, with no weapons beyond his bare hands, even an eating knife he had carried in his jerkin had been taken away, leaving him to the uncomfortable reflection that he was going to have to dine with his fingers, was a pastime that occupied him for several hours on the first day. On the second day the rats began to bore him. By that evening they were annoying him, and when the third day dawned bright and warm, as near as he could tell from the tiny slip of window at the top of his cell, Jonas was telling himself that any move at all was a move in the right direction. He set up a shout for one of the guards, the bald one who had brought his meals every day, but the black-haired one was the man who checked his cell at night. For once, Jonas thought, he was lucky. The bald man appeared, after some 15 minutes of screaming and cursing. Jonas was not at all sure whether the black-haired man understood the language. There was little trace of it in his mind, and virtually nothing that might be called intelligence. With the bald man, at least, he could communicate. "What's wanted?" the guard said sourly, staring through the bars. Jonas smiled softly. "You know why I'm here, don't you?" he said in a voice as close to silky as he could make it. "You?" the bald man said. "You're here, in a cell." "That's right," Jonas said patiently. He rubbed his face. "Do you know why I was put here?" "You cast spells. You make things happen." "That's right," Jonas said, smiling again. "I'm a wizard. A warlock. That's what they say, isn't it?" "You make things happen," the bald man said. But he had the basic idea. Jonas checked that in his mind. "Very well," he said. "Now, I wish to see Herr Knopf." "The Inquisitor calls you when he wants you," the bald man said. "Now," Jonas said. "When he wants—" "If I am a wizard," Jonas said, "I have powers. Strange powers. I could make you—" he reflected for a minute. "I could make you into a beetle and squash you underfoot. As a matter of fact, I think I will." He gazed reflectively at the bald man, who gulped and turned a little pale. You are in a cell," he said at last. "Locked up." "Do you think that will stop me?" Jonas said. He came to the barred door, still smiling. "You would not dare." "Why not?" Jonas asked. "What have I got to lose?" He raised one hand, clawing the fingers slightly. He took a deep breath, as if he were about to spit out an incantation. His eyes glittered, the smile broadened. A long second passed. "I will tell the Inquisitor you wish to see him," the bald guard said. Jonas relaxed and stepped back. "I shall be most grateful," he said formally. The guard turned and started to walk away. 5 paces down the corridor the walk turned into a run. Jonas watched him go. and then sat down on his louse-infested cot to await developments. The minutes ticked by endlessly. He thought of trying to reach Claerten, but decided, not entirely with a regret, that the contact would use up too much energy, and he needed all the energy he could conserve now. The second step had been taken. The fact that he sat in a cell in a prison was proof of that. The third step, the all-important final step, was about to begin. George Knupf was a tall man, with a skin the colour and apparent texture of good leather. He had a face like an eagle, and his eyes were ice blue. He moved his thin, strong hands gently back and forth on the table that held his papers, inkstand and pen, and said, in a voice like audible sandpaper, "You wanted to see me." "True," Jonas said pleasantly. Knupf was sitting behind the table. Jonas had not been asked to sit. He remained standing, and he was reasonably sure that his feet were going to hurt in a minute. He tried not to let the thought disturb him. The man's mind was like his office in the town hall, sparsely furnished, almost austere, but with all the necessaries laid out for easy access. Underneath the strength and iron of the mind, Jonas caught the spark glowing, and nearly smiled, in spite of the reports. In spite of logic, there had been a chance the Brotherhood had guessed wrongly about this man. Now that chance was gone, and the Brotherhood was right again. "Not many asked to see me," Knupf said in the same voice. He went on looking at his hands. There was bitterness in his mind, bitterness that had changed to hate. "Their pleas tend to be exactly the opposite." "I did not plead," Jonas pointed out. "It was necessary that I come to see you." The question was, he told himself, exactly what were the Inquisitor's real beliefs? His public professions were well known. Jonas searched and found the answer. Knupf was an honest man. That, of course, made matters simpler. "Necessary?" Knupf said, looking up for the first time. His gaze stabbed like a sword. He was uneasy, Jonas knew. With another mind probing his, he could not help but be uneasy. But he could not find a cause. It would never occur to him, and he controlled his feelings superbly. "You believe that I am a wizard?" Jonas said. Knupf waited a bare second, and then nodded. "I can do many things," Jonas went on. "It was necessary that I bring these to your attention, and prove to you that they are not wizardry or magic." "Many have told me," Knupf muttered, "that their feats were natural. It is a common defence." "So I have heard," Jonas said easily. "But I shall prove what I say." "I am under no compulsion to listen to you," Knupf said after a pause. Jonas shrugged. His feet were beginning to hurt, he realized. He sighed briefly, but there was no time or attention to spare for them. "I could only see you by having myself accused of witchcraft," he said. "In that way you would be forced to listen to me. You may listen now, or later, at a full hearing of the Inquisitor's court." "And I am to take my choice?" Knupf said. He smiled briefly. His face remained cold. The strong hands moved on the tabletop. "It is a matter of indifference to me," Jonas said, "but the wait becomes boring after a time." Knupf's eyebrows went up. "Boring is hardly the word others would use." "I am not like others," Jonas said. He wished for Claerten suddenly, but there was no way to reach him safely. He had to make his move alone. Well, he told himself, that was what he had wanted. "I can tell what is in your mind," he said. The words hung in the air of the room for a long time. At last Knupf nodded. "The devil grants to many his power of seeing the minds of men," he said quietly. "This is not devil's work, as I shall prove," Jonas said. He shifted his feet. "But let me establish one point at a time, in the most scholastic manner, if you will permit." "I permit," Knupf said. There was interest in his mind, overlaid with scepticism, of course, but interest all the same. That, Jonas thought, was a better sign than he had dared to hope for. "Very well," he said. "Think of a word. Think of any single word. I shall tell it to you." "As any wizard might do who has the help of his lord the devil," Knupf muttered. "Do you expect this to prove—" "One thing at a time," Jonas said. Knupf nodded. A second passed. Jonas licked his lips. The possibilities paraded before him. On one hand, success. On the other, there was the torture and death of the Inquisition. Jonas took a deep breath. There was no way to back out now. Heroism looked a little empty, though. He closed his eyes. Cabbages, he said. Knopf neither applauded nor looked surprised.
As I have said, he murmured, that which the devil can grant.
He paused and looked down at his hands.
Am I to take this as a confession? He said. Do you wish to hurry your own death?
I am no wizard, Jonas said.
A stranger, Knopf said, who enters a small city, is seen at mysterious undertakings, plucks words out of the centre of a man's mind. Why, the picture is a classic one. Del Rio himself, Holzinger, or any of the others could not describe a better.
Yet all this was done to draw your attention, to fix it on what I have to tell you, Jonas said, shifting his feet again. I am no wizard, but a man who may do certain things, and here is my proof. You may do the same yourself. The silence was a long one, and at the end of it Knopf rose. He walked to the door of the room and opened it, and the bald-headed guard came in.
He has tried to tempt me to pact with Satan, the Inquisitor said. But take him away.
Some day, Jonas thought, back in his cell, there would be a method of controlling minds that did not require the willing cooperation of the two parties. Some day the man who reads minds would be more than a passive onlooker. But the talent was new. It needed practice. It needed training. The cell grew dark as the night came, and the dampness seemed to increase. Jonas heard squeaking and thought of the rats, but he couldn't even summon up enough energy to try for them. He sat cross-legged in a corner of the cell and closed his eyes. He sighed once, deeply. This was what a hero came to, he told himself. This was the end of heroics and playing a lone hand. Why, if he had to do it all over again, You would do exactly the same thing, Claerten's voice said. Jonas grinned suddenly and sat straighter. I should have known you'd be getting into contact sooner or later, he thought. I try to keep track of all our men, Claerten thought. In a case like yours, I try harder. My foolishness, Jonas thought, sometimes works to my benefit. Claerten's thought was wry.
If you hadn't got impatient and tried to hurry things, his voice said in Jonas's mind, you wouldn't be back in your cell now. There is a time and a place for your disclosure.
Another day in here would have driven me out of my wits, Jonas thought.
Better out of your wits than dead,
Claerten thought. Jonas sighed.
However, Claerten went on, there is still a way out for you. I have read the situation in your mind, and your next move will have to be rather more spectacular than usual.
So long as it works, Jonas said, I will be satisfied.
It will work, Claerten said. At least I think it will.
Another day dragged by. Jonas put in his time alternately going over the new plan and feeling more frightened than he had ever believed possible. Claerten reached him once, but the contact was weak and fleeting. The director hadn't enough strength to reach him again, at least not for a day or so. Jonas was exactly where he'd wanted to be, on his own. He hated the idea. Time passed, somehow. When morning dawned, Jonas awoke to find the door of his cell being unlocked. The bald man and the black-haired man were both there. He looked up at them with distaste. Then he saw what was in their minds, and the distaste changed to fear.
You have confessed, the bald one said. It is necessary that you ratify your confession. Come with us.
Jonas knew what that meant. A ratification of a free confession took place under torture. He wiped his face with one hand, but he hardly thought of escaping. He had to go through with the plan. The two guards came into the cell and gripped his arms. Jonas allowed himself to be carried out into the corridor, and down it to a great wooden door. The guards opened it and dragged him through. The torture chamber was brightly lit, with torches in brackets along the walls that gave off, by a small fraction, more light than smoke. In one corner the rack itself stood, and there were other tools of the trade scattered around the room. Jonas found that he was sweating. The guards brought him to the centre of the room. Knopf was standing near him, a perfectly blank expression on his face. His voice was the same rough rasp, but it seemed almost mechanical.
You have confessed to me, he said, your heresy. Now you will be made to ratify your confession. That done, your penalty will be exacted.
And the penalty, of course, would be death. Death at the stake. He forced himself to remain calm. Now was the time for his play. He took a deep breath and felt the strength in him gather to a single point and flow outward. The two men suddenly seemed to stagger. There was a second of confusion, and they had let him go. He stood alone in the room. He turned and walked to the door, but he did not open it. Instead, he leaned against it. He forced his voice into the patterns of calmness and ease. "Your men cannot touch me," he said.
"Wizard?"
"No," Jonas said. The confusion he was broadcasting kept the men from doing anything that required even a simple plan, but he couldn't keep it up for long. "A man like yourself, a man with a particular talent given by God."
"The name of God?"
"I can say that name," Jonas told the Inquisitor. "No wizard may say it."
"It's a trick,"
Knupf said. Jonas shook his head. "Not at all. I will ask you to do nothing against the faith. I will merely ask you to test for yourself what I say."
"You are a heretic," Knupf said stubbornly. "I cannot."
"You can pray," Jonas said. Knupf blinked.
"Pray?"
he said. "Meditate on a prayer," Jonas said. "Keep your mind open. Keep yourself ready for the gift of God. It will descend on you." Knupf shook his head.
"It is a trick," he began.
"A trick?" Jonas said. "With the prayers of God and his church?" And that was the unanswerable question, for no wizard could use the name of God. No wizard could pray. So the Inquisition said. So Knupf said. So Knupf had to say, and so he had to believe. Slowly his mind opened and became receptive. The prayer hung in the air of the smoky room. Jonas slipped in. "Now," he said quietly. His control slipped. The two guards came towards him, overpowered, and held him in a brief second.
"Wait,"
the Inquisitor said heavily.
"Wait. Release him." And so, Claerten thought, the job was accomplished.
Naturally, Jonas thought. Claerten's thought had an overtone of weariness.
"There is no need to be smug," he told Jonas. "After all, you did not do the job yourself."
Unimportant, Jonas thought. The man is convinced. He can be trained further and join the Brotherhood.
"It will take time," Claerten said. "A few years, perhaps, but in the meantime there will be no trials in Speyer."
No trials, Jonas thought. But... oh, I see.
"Of course," Claerten thought. "Any man who considers himself a wizard will have his mind seen by the Inquisitor, and since there are no wizards, at least none we have discovered—"
"The trials will cease," Jonas finished.
"And the Brotherhood has gained a new member," Claerten said. "A member with influence and power. It is an important step forward, Jonas."
"Of course," Jonas thought disinterestedly.
"Yet you seem bored by the matter," Claerten thought, puzzled. "And I don't see... oh, I see the woman in your mind, the daughter. And
now stop it," Jonas thought. "Stop it. Cut off. After all," he finished, "there are times when even a hero wants a little privacy." Postscript. In 1605 to 1606, in Offenburg, there were no executions. H. C. Lee, Materials Towards a History of Witchcraft, Volume 3, page 1148. The End. End of Wizard by Larry M. Harris.
Zen by Jerome Bixby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zen by Jerome Bixby. It's difficult when you're on one of the asteroids to keep from tripping, because it's almost impossible to keep your eyes on the ground. They never got around to putting portholes in spaceships, you know. Unnecessary when you're flying by GB and psychologically inadvisable besides. So an asteroid is about the only place apart from Luna where you can really see the stars. There are so many stars in an asteroid sky that they look like clouds, like massive, heaped-up silver clouds, floating slowly around the inner surface of the vast ebony sphere that surrounds you and your tiny foothold. They are near enough to touch, and you want to touch them. but they are so frighteningly far away and so beautiful. There's nothing in creation half so beautiful as an asteroid sky. You don't want to look down naturally. I had left the Lucky Pierre to search for fossils. I'm David Kuntz, the Lucky Pierre's paleontologist. Somewhere off in the darkness on either side of me were Joe Hargraves gadgeting for mineral deposits, and Ed Reese hopefully on the lookout for anything alive. The Lucky Pierre was back of us, her body out of sight behind a low black ridge, only her gleaming nose poking above, like a porpoise coming up for air. When I looked back, I could see along the jagged rim of the ridge the busy, reflected flickerings of the bubble camp the techs were throwing together. Otherwise, all was black, except for our blue-white torch beams that darted here and there over the gritty, rocky surface. The 29 of us were ETI Team 17, whose assignment was the asteroids. We were 4 years and 3 months out of Terra, and we'd reached Vesta right on schedule. 10 minutes after landing, we had known that the clod was part of the crust of Planet X, or Sorn to give it its right name, one of the few such parts that hadn't been blown clean out of the solar system. That made Vesta extra special. It meant settling down for a while. It meant a careful months-long scrutiny of Vesta's every square inch, and a lot of her cubic ones, especially by the life scientists. Fossils, artifacts, animate life. A surface chunk of Sorn might harbor any of these, or all. Some we'd tackled already had a few. In a day or so, of course, we'd have the one-man beetles and crew boats out, and the floodlights orbiting overhead, and Vesta would be as exposed to us as a molecule on a microscreen. Then work would start in earnest. But in the meantime, and as usual, Hargraves, Reese, and I were out prowling, our weighted boots clomping along in darkness. Captain Feldman had long ago given up trying to keep his science-minded charges from galloping off alone like this. In spite of being a military man, Feld's a nice guy. He just shrugs and says, "Scientists," when we appear brightly at the airlock, waiting to be let out. So the 3 of us went our separate ways, and soon were out of sight of one another. Ed Reese, the biologist, was looking hardest for animate life, naturally, but I found it. I had crossed a long, rounded expanse of rock, lava, wonderfully colored, and was descending into a boulder-cluttered pocket. I was nearing the bottom of the chunk, the part that had been the deepest beneath Sorn's surface before the blow-up. It was the likeliest place to look for fossils. But instead of looking for fossils, my eyes kept rising to those incredible stars. You get that way, particularly after several weeks of living in steel. And it was lucky that I got that way this time, or I might have missed the zen. My feet tangled with a rock, I started a slow, light-gravity fall and looked down to catch my balance. My torch beam flickered across a small, red-furred teddy bear shape. The light passed on. I brought it sharply back to target. My hair did not stand on end, regardless of what you've heard me quoted as saying. Why should it have, when I already knew Yurt so well, considered him in fact one of my closest friends? The Zen was standing by a rock, one paw resting on it, ears cocked forward, its stubby hind legs braced ready to launch it into flight. Big, yellow eyes blinked unemotionally at the glare of the torch, and I cut down its brilliance with a twist of the polarizer lens. The creature stared at me, looking ready to jump halfway to Mars or straight at me if I made a wrong move. I addressed it in its own language, clucking my tongue and whistling through my teeth. Zen. In the blue-white light of the torch, the Zen shivered. It didn't say anything. I thought I knew why. 3,000 years of darkness and silence. I said, "I won't hurt you," again speaking in its own language. The Zen moved away from the rock, but not away from me. It came a little closer, actually, and peered up at my helmeted, mirror-glassed head. Unmistakably the seat of intelligence, it appears, of any race, anywhere. Its mouth, almost human-shaped, worked. Finally words came. It hadn't spoken except to itself for 3,000 years. "You are not Zen," it said. "Why, how do you speak Zenakai?" It took me a couple of seconds to untangle the squeaking syllables and get any sense out of them. What I had already said to it were stock phrases that Yurt had taught me. I knew still more, but I couldn't speak Zenakai fluently by any means. Keep this in mind, by the way. I barely knew the language, and the Zen could barely remember it. To save space, the following dialogue is reproduced without bumblings, blank stares, and "what did you says?" In reality, our talk lasted over an hour. "I am an Earthman," I said. Through my earphones, when I spoke, I could faintly hear my own voice as the Zen must have heard it in Vesta's all but non-existent atmosphere. Tiny, metallic, cricket-like. "Yirtman." I pointed at the sky, the incredible sky. "From out there, from another world." It thought about that for a while. I waited. We already knew that the Zens had been better astronomers at their peak than we were right now, even though they'd never mastered space travel, so I didn't expect this one to boggle at the notion of creatures from another world. It didn't. Finally it nodded, and I thought, as I had often before, how curious it was that this gesture should be common to Earthmen and Zen. "So, Irtman," it said, "and you know what I am?" When I understood, I nodded, too. Then I said, "Yes," realizing that the nod wasn't visible through the one-way glass of my helmet. "I am last of Zen," it said. I said nothing. I was studying it closely, looking for the features which Yurt had described to us, the lighter red fur of arms and neck, the peculiar formation of flesh and horn on the lower abdomen. They were there. From the coloring, I knew this Zen was a female. The mouth worked again, not with emotion, I knew, but with the unfamiliar act of speaking. "I have been here for, she hesitated, "I don't know, for 500 of my years." "For about 3,000 of mine," I told her. And then blank astonishment sank home in me. Astonishment at the last two words of her remark. I was already familiar with the Zen's enormous intelligence, knowing Yurt as I did. But imagine thinking to qualify years with my, when just out of nowhere a visitor from another planetary orbit pops up. And there had been no special stress given the distinction, just clear, precise thinking, like Yurt's. I added, still a little awed, "We know how long ago your world died." "I was child then," she said. "I don't know what happened. I have wondered." She looked up at my steel and glass face. I must have seemed like a giant. Well, I suppose I was. "This, what we are on, was part of Sorn, I know. Was it—" she fumbled for a word. "Was it atom explosion?" I told her how Sorn had gotten careless with its hydrogen atoms and had blown itself over half of creation. This, the ETI teams had surmised from scientific records found on Eros, as well as from geophysical evidence scattered throughout the other bodies. "I was child," she said again after a moment. "But I remember things different from this. Air, heat, light. How do I live here?" Again I felt amazement at its intelligence, and it suddenly occurred to me that astronomy and nuclear physics must have been taught in Sorn's elementary schools. Else that my years and atom explosion would have been all but impossible. And now this old creature, remembering back 3,000 years to childhood, probably to those elementary schools, remembering and defining the differences in environment between then and now, and more wondering at its existence in the different now. And then I got my own thinking straightened out. I recalled some of the things we had learned about the Zen. Their average lifespan had been 12,000 years or a little over, so the Zen before me was, by our standards, about 25 years old. Nothing at all strange about remembering when you are 25 the things that happened to you when you were 7. But the Zen's question, even my rationalization of my reaction to it, had given me a chill. Here was no cuddly teddy bear. This creature had been born before Christ. She had been alone for 3,000 years, on a chip of bone from her dead world beneath a sepulchre of stars. The last and greatest Martian civilization, the Lachrai, had risen and fallen in her lifetime, and she was 25 years old. "How do I live here?" she asked again. I got back into my own framework of temporal reference, so to speak, and began explaining to a Zen what a Zen was. I found out later from Yurt that biology, for the reasons which follow, was one of the most difficult studies, so difficult that nuclear physics actually preceded it. I told her that the Zen had been, all evidence indicated, the toughest, hardest, longest-lived creatures God had ever cooked up. Practically independent of their environment, no special ecological niche, just raw, stubborn, tenacious life, developed to a fantastic extreme. A greater force of life than any other known, one that could exist almost anywhere under practically any conditions, even floating in mid-space, which, asteroid or no, this Zen was doing right now. The Zens breathed all right, but it was nothing they'd had to do in order to live. It gave them nothing their incredible metabolism couldn't scrounge up out of rock, or cosmic rays, or interstellar gas, or simply do without for a few thousand years. If the human body is a furnace, then the Zen body is a feeder pile. Maybe that, I thought, was what evolution always worked toward. "Please, will you kill me?" the Zen said. I'd been expecting that. 2 years ago, on the bleak surface of Eros, Yurt had asked Engstrom to do the same thing. But I asked, why? Although I knew what the answer would be, too. The Zen looked up at me. She was exhibiting every ounce of emotion a Zen is capable of, which is a lot. And I could recognize it, but not in any familiar terms. A tiny motion here, a quiver there, but very quiet and still for the most part. And that was the violent expression, restraint. Yurt, after 2 years of living with us, still couldn't understand why we found this confusing. Difficult aliens, or being alien. "I've tried so often to do it myself," the Zen said softly, "but I can't. I can't even hurt myself. Why do I want you to kill me?" She was even quieter. Maybe she was crying. "I'm alone. 500 years, Yurtman. Not too long. I'm still young. But what good is it, life, when there are no other Zen?" "How do you know there are no other Zen?" "There are no others," she said almost inaudibly. I suppose a human girl might have shrieked it. "A child, I thought, when your world blew up, and you survived. Now you're a young 3,000-year-old woman, uneducated, afraid, probably crawling with neuroses. Even so, in your 1,000-year terms, young lady, you're not too old to change." "Will you kill me?" she asked again. And suddenly I was having one of those eye-popping third-row center views of the whole scene. The enormous, beautiful sky, the dead-clawed Vesta, the little creature who stood there staring at me, The brilliant, ignorant, human-like alien, old young creature who was asking me to kill her. For a moment, the human quality of her thinking terrified me. The feeling you might have waking up some night and finding your pet puppy sitting on your chest, looking at you with wise eyes and white fangs gleaming. Then I thought of Yurt, smart, friendly Yurt who had learned to laugh and wisecrack, and I came out of the jeebies. I realized that here was only a sick girl, no tiny monster. And if she were as resilient as Yurt, well, it was his problem. He'd probably pull her through. But I didn't pick her up. I made no attempt to take her back to the ship. Her tiny white teeth and tiny yellow claws were harder than steel, and she was, I knew, unbelievably strong for her size. If she got suspicious or decided to throw a phobic tizzy, she could scatter shreds of me over a square acre of Vesta in less time than it would take me to yelp. "Will you—" she began again. I tried shakily. "Hell no, wait here." Then I had to translate it. I went back to the Lucky Pierre and got Yurt. We could do without him, even though he had been a big help. We'd taught him a lot. He'd been a child at the blow-up, too. And he'd taught us a lot. But this was more important, of course. When I told him what had happened, he was very quiet, crying perhaps, just like a human being with happiness. Cap Feldman asked me what was up, and I told him. And he said, "Well, I'll be blessed." I said, "Yurt, are you sure you want us to keep hands off, just go off and leave you?" "Yes, please." Feldman said, "Well, I'll be blessed." Yurt, who spoke excellent English, said, "Bless you all." I took him back to where the female waited. From the ridge I knew the entire crew was watching through binocs. I set him down, and he fell to studying her intently. "I am not a Zen," I told her, giving my torch full brilliance for the crew's sake. "But Yurt here is. Do you see? Do you know what you look like?" She said, "I can see enough of my own body and yes." "Yurt," I said, "here's the female we thought we might find. Take over." Yurt's eyes were fastened on the girl. "What do I do now?" she whispered worriedly. "I'm afraid that's something only a Zen would know," I told her, smiling inside my helmet. "I'm not a Zen. Yurt is." She turned to him. "You will tell me?" "If it becomes necessary." He moved closer to her, not even looking back to talk to me. "Give us some time to get acquainted, will you, Dave? And you might leave some supplies and a bubble at the camp when you move on, just to make things pleasanter." By this time he had reached the female. They were as still as space, not a sound, not a motion. I wanted to hang around, but I knew how I'd feel if a Zen, say, wouldn't go away if I were the last man alive and had just met the last woman. I moved my torch off them and headed back for the Lucky Pierre. We all had a drink to the saving of a great race that might have become extinct. Ed Reese, though, had to do some worrying before he could down his drink. "What if they don't like each other?" he asked anxiously. "They don't have much choice," Captain Feldman said, always the realist. "Why do homely women fight for jobs on the most isolated space outposts?" Reese grinned. "That's right. They look awful good after a year or two in space. Make that 25 by Zen standards or 3,000 by ours," said Joe Hargraves. "And I'll bet they look beautiful to each other." We decided to drop our investigation of Vesta for the time being and come back to it after the honeymoon. 6 months later, when we returned, there were 1,200 Zen on Vesta. Captain Feldman was a realist, but he was also a deeply moral man. He went to Yurt and said, "It's indecent. Couldn't the two of you control yourselves at least a little? 1,200 kids? We were rather surprised ourselves, Yurt said complacently. But this seems to be how Zen reproduce. Can you have only half a child? Naturally, Feld got the authorities to quarantine Vesta. Good God, the Zen could push us clear out of the solar system in a couple of generations. I don't think they would, but you can't take such chances, can you? End of Zen by Jerome Bixby.